Welcome to Beltrami County in northern Minnesota, a land of lakes and forest. The Mississippi flows north and east from nearby Lake Itasca and makes its first southward turn about a mile east of Lake Bemidji, which it traverses. The name Bemidji comes from the Ojibwe Indian word Bemidjigamug, which means crossing water. Our landscape was carved by glaciers which gouged lake beds. Melting water beneath tunneled courses for today's rivers. The last glacier went out between 12 and 9,000 years ago. Early Americans lived here, most likely in the interval between the last two glaciers. The oldest carbon-dated dwelling was a fishing camp between what are now the towns of Bemidji and Cass Lake. It was built 5,000 years ago. A progression of Indian tribes have lived here, including Arikara, Dakota, and today's Ojibwe, or Chippewa, whose name for themselves is Anishinaabe, meaning original people. Red Lake Reservation, 45 miles north of Bemidji, is the only closed reservation in Minnesota on Aboriginal land that is owned in common by the enrolled tribal members. Early white explorers and fur traders came through here, including mapmaker David Thompson in the late 1700s, Italian Count Giacomo Constantino Beltrami, for whom this county is named, and Indian agent Henry Schoolcraft, who was guided to the source of the Mississippi at Elk Lake, which he named Itasca. In his journal, Schoolcraft writes,
"What had been long sought at last appeared suddenly. On turning out of a thicket into a small weedy opening, the sight of a transparent body of water burst upon our view. It was Itasca, the source of the Mississippi River."
The fur trade ended around 1847, and loggers and settlers arrived in the 1890s. Beltrami County was created by the state of Minnesota February 28, 1866, and officially organized in 1897, with its county seat located in Bemidji. The land was covered by gigantic stands of pine so thick and tall that their canopy dimmed daylight at high noon. With the completion of the Great Northern Rail Line from Boston to Bemidji in 1898, the pioneer era came to an end. Stagecoaches and freight wagons no longer carried travelers and supplies over rough roads. The first passenger train arrived that same year, and as the train crossed the Mississippi Bridge in Bemidji, passengers had a platform view of the future Broadway of northern Minnesota. At the grand opening of the new brick and limestone Great Northern Depot on January 17, 1913, Empire builder James J. Hill announced,
"I feel at home in Bemidji. I feel that you are my neighbors and that we are good neighbors. I like the community spirit here. It is one of the best signs of the times."
The development of a new railway system set the stage for large-scale sawmills and the beginning of the northern lumbering era. The Crookston Lumber Company was the first big sawmill built in Beltrami County on the southeast shore of Lake Bemidji. Millions of board feet of logs were driven along the pathways of streams and rivers and shipped to all parts of the United States. Logging was a winter to spring industry, and sawmilling was done in the summer. After timberland was first located, appraised, and acquired, a crew was hired. Camps were built, supplies delivered, logging roads cut and iced, and logs were skidded and loaded onto horse-drawn sleighs and banked along waterways or rail lines. A lumberjack remembers.
"Most camps look like a small village, sometimes housing and feeding as many as 250 men with 50 men in one bunkhouse. We hated crawling out of bed at 5 a.m. to get into our wool underwear. At least 2 pairs of wool socks, wool pants, and a heavy woolen or flannel shirt, but we always had a hearty breakfast of meat, taters, and eggs, and washed down with good, strong camp coffee."
The last log drive on the Mississippi took place in the 1920s from a river bluff 10 miles east of Bemidji, preserved as the Island Point Canoe Landing. Homestead farming followed the disappearance of the lumber companies, with high hopes, but faced great difficulties. Much of the soil here is sandy. Winters are harsh and long. Lakes usually freeze in November and thaw in April. At the peak, there were about 2,500 full-time family farms in the county. Most farmers supplemented their income with logging work. Some hired out to Red River Valley farms west of here after their own crops were planted, leaving their families to maintain crops and livestock and return in the fall to harvest. Second and third generation farmers found it increasingly difficult to make a living from the land. One after another, they had to find other work, at first part-time, then full-time. In the early 1900s, the population was made up largely of lumberjacks and railroad workers. It was heavily Scandinavian, German, and Indian. Immigrants and new arrivals placed a high value on education for their children. One-room schools dotted the countryside, often on land donated by settlers and farmers. School children walked, rode horses, or were transported by wagons turned into winter sleighs. A teacher's training college was authorized by the state of Minnesota in 1913. It has grown over the decades and evolved first into a state college and is now Bemidji State University. Along with the rest of the nation, Beltrami County fell into the economic depression of the 1930s. Major logging operations had moved west. Farming was difficult at best and made worse by the Depression and Dust Bowl years. Repeated forest fires fueled by the left-behind slash of logging swept the area. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC of the 1930s, replanted many thousands of acres. There were several camps in the area, including Rabidoo, 6 miles south of Black Duck. In the 1950s and 60s, encouraged by the Federal Soil Bank program, farmlands were reforested. Today is a page in tomorrow's history books, and the stories told by people indigenous to this land, early settlers and farmers, lumberjacks and landowners, educators and shopkeepers filled the pages of yesteryear, for history is the key to our community's identity. It is the common thread that weaves Beltrami County's rich heritage along the pathways of future generations.